So let's talk about shifting to Shorebird and what you're trying to what your North Star is, what your goal with this company is. You'd sort of mentioned moving from Apple and working on WebKit and then going to Google and working on WebKit and like Apple having control of WebKit and caring a lot about that project and wanting it to succeed and like building Chrome on that and the sort of like challenges you had with that interface. And I'm interested as you're moving into this company where the company is based on Flutter and the core technologies around that. But Flutter is still a Google project largely. And I'm curious about like, yeah, where are you trying to go and how are you thinking about the interface at this point?
Yeah. So the first thing that we're trying to solve is we're trying to fill in the pieces, right? So one of the things that the incentives that we were under, that I was under as leading the Flutter team, was to build a piece that fit in Google's puzzle, right? Didn't overlap with too many other pieces or cause conflict with too many pieces and worked with Google technologies, right? And it was good. But I think that you have a different puzzle. You, Justin, have a different puzzle than a random Google engineer does. And so the first thing that we're trying to do is make sure that the set of stuff that you need to be successful as you, Justin, with Flutter is there. And the first hole that we sought to fill was the number one most upvoted issue of all time across Flutter, and one of the most upvoted across all of GitHub, which was missing code push for Flutter. So code push is the idea of being able to update your code instantly across all your users, just like you do when you push to the web, just like you do when you push to server, just like you do with honestly any normal development environment. It's just we've somehow acclimated to this idea in mobile that all of our teams are just going to be like NASA, where like we prep for many months and then we bottle it up and send it to Mars and hope that when it gets there in 3 months, it's going to work perfectly. And just the reality is the world doesn't work that way. And so code push is the way that all apps function. If you look at all the big apps on your phone, the TikToks and Facebooks and YouTubes and whatever, they all automatically update as you launch them in different ways. They've all built their own, sort of different solutions for that. And that's just necessary because again, like right now we're recording, it's Thanksgiving week in the United States. We're about to have, Black Friday where all the stores make all their money. Can you imagine as a commerce, if you're, a Flutter app that's commerce based and you are down for an hour on Black Friday, that's just unacceptable. And so that's why something like code push has to exist. We were talking to a very large customer, and they were telling us last week that one of the cool things that they've figured out is that like when they have a bug in production, maybe not a fatal bug, but like a bug, they now realize that they can just push logs. They can just push logs and go to lunch, which is like a normal thing you would do as a web developer, right? Push logs, go to lunch, and come back and deal with your logs after that. But now they can do that on mobile that they just had never realized was possible. And so they come back from lunch and they just have logs from the field of like, this is what's going on in our app. This is how we debug this. And then they fix it after lunch in another push. And that's just how development should go. And so like you asked, what is Shorebird solving? We're just filling in the pieces. We started with this piece. It turned out it was way harder than I thought it was going to be, which we can talk about. But like we had to build a whole bunch of crazy stuff to do it. But so we filled in this code push and then we've built a CI product mostly because we needed to do it for our own. So it turns out we have a lot of Dart code. We wrote our servers in Dart. We wrote our command line in Dart. We wrote a whole bunch of stuff. And so we needed a really good CI system for that. So we built one for ourselves and we made it available to others. And we've seen some large Flutter projects move to it. We're just filling in the pieces. And then the long term is that coming to Shorebird should be like downloading Unity or, as a business going to Red Hat or whatever. And like, you just feel like, oh, they have all the things that I want. They get me. I think React Native has some of this in from Expo, right? It's just like, oh, they get me. They understand me. They have all the things I want. And oh yeah, they take a credit card and I can pay for the things that I want and not pay for the things I don't want. And that's how it should be, right? Because there are millions of Flutter developers. There was a stat that Google published last year that a third of all free apps submitted in the previous year had been Flutter apps, right? The Stack Overflow survey showed that Dart is slightly larger, I think, than Swift, right? This is a very large community. And where's the Flutter company? Where's the company I can come to and they just give me this big warm hug of course you're going to be successful with Flutter. We're going to make sure that you're successful with Flutter. And that's what we're building.
Yeah, the code push stuff probably unlocked a lot for Flutter developers. Like you just mentioned the Toyota project. Like I'm sure they couldn't confidently ship that if they didn't have over-the-air updates to fix their cars. Because how else do you update a car?
Yeah.
So let's dig into that code push stuff. You said it was a lot harder than you thought it was going to be. How much work did you think it was up front? And then how much did it end up being? And like, what were the steps that it took to get there?
So that was another lesson in business to me. I think that it took us about a month to get the Android version going, and then maybe 2 or 3 to get the iOS version. And I think that we could have more aggressively sort of stopped there and tried to sell. But the engineer in me wanted to make it amazing. And so we spent then another 2 years, almost, year and a half, making the iOS part in particular. iOS has more restrictions than Android does, making it amazing. And the part that makes it really hard is that we have had to teach the Dart system. So Dart already had an interpreter, and you need an interpreter in order to comply with App Store guidelines. So the App Store says you can update your app as much as you want. Just you have 2 things. One of which is that you have to use an interpreter if you want to update it, and you can't change the purpose of your app, right? They don't want you like selling a game and turning it into a gambling app for some regions, or I think that's like a real historical example. They don't want you doing that, and that's fine because again, all of the largest apps work this way. All of them do. But it was really hard to take Dart's interpreter, which was very slow because interpreters are very slow, and make it work really well in production. Because our initial iOS demo, just whenever you would patch the app, whenever you would like turn on Shorebird, it just suddenly your app would get super slow because it was interpreting everything. And so the real hard thing that we did was we taught it how to, without you pre-committing within your Dart code, which parts were going to be interpreted versus not, for us to dynamically, without you having to do anything, magically figure out, okay, we're going to run this part of your app in the interpreter and this part not. And I can go into more details as much as you like. This is a DevTools podcast after all. But it turns out to be a very hard problem.
Yeah. Does iOS like limit some optimizations? Like, do they disallow JIT? I don't really.
They do not allow JIT.
Yeah.
So the technical restriction on iOS is that you cannot get a page of memory. A page is just like a unit of memory. But you can't get a page of memory that has ever been writable to be then executable or other way around. Or I think maybe you can get one that was executable, but it loses its executable bit if you want to make it writable. And there are some, like you can get the JIT permission during development time. You can get the JIT permission when Xcode is connected. But in general, you cannot get writable memory to be executable, which is what you need for JIT. And so you are stuck then using interpreting, which is fine. Again, that's what their guidelines say, and we're happy to follow them, and we do. But you have to use an interpreter, and interpreters are just very slow. Hermes, which you mentioned before, does have some interpreting capability. And one of the things that they do is they have a very high level interpreter. We haven't gone down that route so high level in this sense is good, right? Because instead of breaking a for loop into, 100 different little pieces like that you would do if you would compiled it, not 100, but 3 or whatever. The for loop is just one command. I don't know that. I haven't like gone and looked at their IL, but I would expect that's how they work, that they have a high level interpreter.